When people think of cannibals, they usually picture remote tribes living somewhere far away from the modern world. Scotland probably isn't the first place that comes to mind, but one of the most infamous cannibal stories ever told is said to have happened there. It's the story of a man named Sawney Bean. According to the legend, he and his family spent nearly 25 years living inside a hidden sea cave, preying on travelers who passed through the roads of southwestern Scotland. And if the stories are to be believed, they didn't just kill a handful of people. They killed hundreds, maybe even more than 1,000. But that's not the part that made the legend famous. According to those same stories, after murdering their victims, they dragged the bodies back to the cave and ate them. If any of this actually happened, then we're talking about one of the most horrifying cases Europe has ever seen. And if it didn't happen, it's still one of the darkest and most disturbing serial killer legends that survived for centuries. Most versions of the story place Alexander Sawney Bean somewhere in 15th or 16th century Scotland. According to the legend, he came from a poor working-class family. His father dug ditches for a living, and his mother earned money trimming hedges. For a while, Sawney tried following the same path. He took on regular work and attempted to live an ordinary life. But it didn't last. Before long, he realized he had no interest in hard work or living by society's rules. Eventually, he left home and ran away with a woman who, depending on which version of the story you're reading, was described as either deeply immoral or a witch. Some versions of the legend even identify her as a woman known as Black Agnes. Either way, the two seem to be a perfect match. They eventually settled inside a coastal cave near what's now the town of Girvan in southwestern Scotland. And this wasn't just some small hiding place. The cave stretched deep into the cliffs, and whenever the tide came in, the entrance disappeared completely underwater. It was the perfect place for people who didn't want to be found. According to the legend, Sawney and his wife lived there for nearly 25 years without anyone discovering them. And during those years, their family continued to grow. The stories claim they eventually had 8 sons and 6 daughters, and that was just the beginning. As the years went by, the family kept growing. The stories claim they eventually had 18 grandsons and 14 granddaughters. Some versions even go a step further, alleging that many of those children were the result of incest within the family itself. What all versions of the story seem to agree on is that the Bean family had no interest in working for a living. Instead, they survived by ambushing travelers. Night after night, they would hide near the roads and wait for the right opportunity, sometimes for hours. Then, when a lone traveler or a small group got close enough, they'd strike without warning. By that point, the family had become so large that anyone they targeted was hopelessly outnumbered. There was usually no way to escape. But as the clan continued to grow, simple robbery wasn't enough anymore. Stealing money and supplies could only go so far when there were dozens of mouths to feed. And according to the legend, that's when the Beans took things even further. The stories claim they began eating their victims. After each attack, they would drag the bodies back to the cave and butcher them there. Some of the meat was eaten immediately. The rest was supposedly stored for later, turning the cave into a gruesome food supply. As the years passed, the number of victims continued to grow. Eventually, the family was said to be killing so many people that they didn't even use every part of the bodies anymore. According to the stories, unwanted remains were sometimes thrown into the sea. And every now and then, pieces of human remains would wash up along the shoreline, where they were discovered by local residents. Naturally, people started asking questions. Bodies were turning up, people were disappearing, but nobody had the slightest idea who was responsible. The Bean family rarely left the cave during the day. They stayed hidden inside and only came out after dark. Because of that, they managed to remain invisible for years. Farmers, merchants, and local residents had no idea that just a short distance away, an entire family of alleged killers and cannibals was living in secret. As more and more people vanished, larger search parties were organized. Groups were sent out to hunt for whoever was behind the disappearances. One version of the legend even claims that searchers came remarkably close to discovering the cave. But the idea that anyone could actually be living inside it seemed so unlikely that they simply moved on without investigating further. As fear and frustration spread, innocent people started paying the price. Several individuals were accused without evidence, attacked by angry locals, and blamed for crimes they had nothing to do with. But despite all of that, the disappearances continued. In many cases, suspicion fell on the owners of local inns and taverns, since they were often the last people known to have seen the victims alive. Then, after 25 years of hiding and countless alleged murders, the Bean family's story finally began moving toward its end. According to the most famous version of the legend, it happened one night when Sawney Bean and his clan targeted a married couple returning home from a local fair. But this time, things didn't go according to plan. The husband wasn't like their previous victims. He was a skilled fighter. When the clan attacked, he drew his sword and fought back, managing to keep several of them at bay. Meanwhile, his wife was struck down early in the attack after being severely wounded by a gunshot from one of the attackers. She collapsed to the ground, but her husband refused to run. Instead, he kept fighting. The harder they pushed, the harder he fought back. And just as the clan was finally close to overwhelming him, something unexpected happened. A large group of travelers returning from the same fair appeared on the road. The sudden arrival of witnesses forced Sawney Bean and the others to retreat. Some versions of the story tell it a little differently. In those accounts, the clan first killed a woman and a laborer before attacking another man who happened to be carrying a pistol. When he fired the weapon, the sound drew the attention of other people nearby and exposed the attack. Either way, word spread quickly. The people coming back from the fair immediately reported what had happened to the local authorities. The authorities followed the attackers' trail and tracked them to the area around the cave. But once they got there, the trail seemed to disappear. At the time, many believed the killers were somehow using the sea to travel in and out of the area. So guards remained nearby, watching and waiting. Then the tide went out, and that's when they finally saw it, the hidden entrance to the cave. According to the legend, news of the discovery soon reached King James VI of Scotland. When he heard about the crimes that had supposedly been taking place, he decided to launch a massive operation to hunt the family down. The story claims the king assembled around 400 armed men, along with a large pack of hunting dogs, and personally sent them into the region. Eventually, the cave was found, and what supposedly waited inside was even worse than anyone had imagined. According to the legend, the cave floor was covered with human remains. The evidence, it was said, of years of murder and cannibalism. The entire clan was captured alive and placed in chains. They were taken to Edinburgh's Tolbooth prison before being transferred to either Leith or Glasgow, depending on the version of the story. And then, without any formal trial, they were quickly executed. But the story of Sawney Bean doesn't end there. In the town of Girvan, not far from where these events supposedly took place, another legend has survived for generations. According to that story, one of Sawney Bean's daughters left the family before the clan was ever discovered and started a new life in Girvan. The legend says she planted a tree there, a tree that would later become known as the Hairy Tree. But after the Bean family was captured, her connection to them was allegedly exposed. And when the townspeople found out who she was, they decided to take matters into their own hands. According to the story, she was hanged from the very tree she had planted herself. What's interesting is that some people claim that tree still stands on Dalrymple Street in Girvan to this day. Of course, whether any of this actually happened is still up for debate. But one thing is certain. Over the centuries, the story of Sawney Bean has become a permanent part of British folklore. That said, most historians remain highly skeptical of the entire story. The biggest problem is simple. There isn't any reliable historical evidence to support it. British researcher Sean Thomas discussed this issue in an article published in 2005. As he pointed out, if something on this scale had really happened, hundreds of people disappearing, a family carrying out murders for decades, and even the king himself becoming involved in the hunt, you'd expect to find some trace of it in the historical record. Letters, diaries, government documents, newspapers, something. But so far, no convincing evidence has ever been found. Thomas also points to the many contradictions between different versions of the legend. For example, some accounts claim King James VI personally ordered the operation to capture the family. Yet other versions place the Bean clan nearly a century before his reign. And according to Thomas, it's also difficult to believe that a group this large could remain completely hidden for 25 years without attracting serious attention. It's equally hard to explain how so many disappearances could continue for so long without triggering a major investigation. The legend does offer an explanation for that. According to the story, reaching the cave was extremely difficult. Even people who occasionally came close to it reportedly assumed nobody could possibly live there. Some versions place a heavy emphasis on just how isolated and inaccessible the cave supposedly was. There's also another theory. Some researchers believe the entire story may have been little more than political propaganda. According to that idea, the legend was created after the Jacobite uprisings in the early 18th century as a way for the English to portray the Scottish as savage and uncivilized. Interestingly, Sean Thomas isn't fully convinced by that explanation either. In his view, things aren't quite that simple. He points out that if the story had truly been created as anti-Scottish propaganda, it would be strange for it to first appear in a collection that was largely focused on English criminals. After all, publishing the story in a book like that would have greatly reduced its impact as a political weapon. And that's where things get even more complicated, because there are a few historical facts that make it difficult to dismiss the legend entirely. We know, for example, that during periods of famine and disease, there were documented reports of cannibalism in parts of Scotland. We also know that Galloway and southwestern Scotland have long been associated with dark folklore, ghost stories, and local legends. In fact, some older tales share certain similarities with the story of the Bean family. That's why some people believe the legend may have started with a real event, a real crime, a real group of outlaws, something that gradually became more exaggerated as it was passed from one generation to the next. Maybe there really was a group of robbers or killers living in the area, and over time their story grew larger and larger until a handful of victims somehow became more than 1,000. Or maybe Sawney Bean never existed at all. Maybe he was simply a character invented to frighten travelers or entertain curious visitors. Or maybe the truth lies somewhere in the middle. Maybe there really was a man who inspired the legend. But maybe his name wasn't Sawney Bean. Maybe the number of victims was far smaller. And maybe there was never a 48-member family of cannibals hiding in a cave. At this point, we'll probably never know for sure. The truth has been buried beneath centuries of storytelling. But one thing is impossible to deny. Whether Sawney Bean was real or not, the impact of this legend on modern horror culture is undeniable. You can see traces of it everywhere. From The Hills Have Eyes to countless novels, films, and horror stories built around cannibalism, isolation, and the collapse of humanity itself. Movies like Cannibal Holocaust and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre draw from that same primal fear, the fear of a person who has abandoned every rule of civilized society and become something else entirely. For decades, writers and filmmakers have used characters like these to explore a simple but unsettling question. What is it that actually makes us human? And at what point does a human being become a monster? History has shown us time and time again that the line between those two things isn't always as clear as we'd like to believe. Maybe that's why the story of Sawney Bean has survived for so long, even if it's nothing more than a legend, because it reminds us that the most terrifying monsters aren't always hiding in caves or deep forests. Sometimes they're hiding inside people. Until the next case, take care of yourselves and each other.